I would rather chew glass than touch that desperate cow. Those were the exact words I heard echoing from my own library on the night of my daughter's engagement party. I froze in the shadows, holding a glass of bourbon, listening as the man she was about to marry laughed with his best friend. He was plotting to drain her trust fund and run off to Miami with a woman named Lexi. Most fathers would have stormed into the room and thrown a punch. But you do not survive 40 years in commercial real estate by losing your temper. You survive by smiling, setting a trap, and burying your enemies so deep they never see the sun again. Hit subscribe, and let me know where you are watching from. Now, let me take you back. The clinking of crystal glasses drifted through the gardens of my Dallas estate. I had just paid $80,000 to transform my backyard into a floral paradise for my only daughter, Natalie. She was a brilliant pediatrician, with a heart far too pure for the ruthless reality of this world. She believed she had found her Prince Charming in Tristan Pierce, a man who introduced himself as a tech startup chief executive officer. Returning from the wine cellar, I heard voices coming from my private library. The oak doors were slightly ajar. "Come on, man. She is not that bad." The voice belonged to Bradley, Tristan's best man. I heard a soft chuckle, followed by the clinking of ice. "Are you kidding me?" Tristan replied, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "She is clingy. She is obsessed. And frankly, she is a desperate cow. But she is the only child of Richard Caldwell. Do you have any idea what that means? Once we sign that registry, I get the keys to the Caldwell Trust Fund. I just have to play the doing husband for 2 years. Then I cash out, file for divorce, and I am back on a yacht in Miami with Lexi." My blood turned to ice. I am Richard Caldwell. I built the largest commercial real estate portfolio in Texas. I have negotiated with men who would cut your throat for $1. But nothing ever made me want to commit violence until that exact second. This arrogant parasite was standing in my home, drinking my scotch, and planning to ruin my daughter's life. He saw her not as a human being, but as an automated teller machine. He saw me as a clueless old man waiting to hand over his empire. My first instinct was to kick the doors open, drag him out by his collar, and throw him onto the street. But my mind immediately calculated the risks. If I attacked him now, I would look like the unhinged, controlling father. Natalie was blinded by love. She would be devastated, and Tristan would spin the narrative to make himself the victim. I needed to handle this with surgical precision. I took a slow, deep breath and pushed the heavy doors open. The thud of the wood hitting the wall made both men jump. Tristan spun around his face, draining of all color. For a fraction of a second, I saw raw, unfiltered panic in his eyes. He knew he was caught. "Richard, sir," Tristan stammered frantically, trying to compose himself. "We were just admiring the architecture." I walked slowly toward them. I kept my face entirely blank. "I heard you," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I heard what you called my daughter. I heard your brilliant exit strategy to Miami." Bradley took a step back, shrinking into the shadows. But Tristan possessed the slick, practiced speed of a career con artist. I watched his mind work, searching for a lifeline, and within seconds, he found one. He forced a condescending laugh. "Richard, you completely misunderstood. I swear to you." Tristan stepped forward, holding his hands up defensively. "We were not talking about Natalie. We were talking about a client, a female investor from Chicago, who has been breathing down my neck for weeks. She is a massive cash cow for my tech firm, but she is desperate and incredibly clingy. Bradley was joking that I should date her to secure the capital, and I said I would rather chew glass. I would never speak about Natalie that way. She is my entire world. It was a flawless lie. Invented in a split second, delivered with fake sincerity. If I did not know the dark souls of men like him, I might have actually believed it. Before I could tear his pathetic alibi apart, the library door opened wider. Natalie walked in. She was radiant, her face flushed with genuine happiness. She wrapped her arms around Tristan from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "What are my favorite men discussing?" she asked with a bright smile. Tristan placed his hand over hers. He kissed her cheek. "Just business, sweetheart. Your father and I were just having a quiet moment." He looked up at me. Over Natalie's shoulder, I saw a challenging smirk play on his lips. He had just pulled his human shield into the crossfire. His eyes dared me to call him a liar, right there in front of the woman who adored him. "Break her heart right now." His smirk seemed to say, "Let us see who she believes." I looked at my daughter. I saw the absolute trust in her eyes. My late wife had raised her to see the good in everyone. It was her greatest strength as a doctor, but right now, it was her fatal weakness. If I spoke without concrete, irrefutable proof, I would break her heart, and I might lose her forever to his manipulations. I needed evidence. I needed to peel back his life, layer by layer, until there was nowhere left for him to hide. "Just business," I repeated. I matched his smile with a cold stare. "Go back and enjoy the party. I need to make a call." Tristan nodded, his confidence restored. He took Natalie's hand and let her out. As the doors clicked shut behind them, the silence returned. I dialed Derek Shaw, a private investigator who used to do corporate espionage work for me. "Derek," I said when he answered. "Tristan Pierce," I said, staring out the window at the party below. "He claims his startup is valued at $20 million. I want you to peel him like an onion. Bank records, offshore accounts, text messages, phone logs. Find a woman named Lexi in Miami. I want to know what he eats for breakfast and who he owes money to. I need it yesterday." "Consider it done, sir." I hung up the phone. I watched Tristan down in the garden, smiling with my friends. He thought he had outsmarted the clueless old man. He thought he was playing a game he could win. But he had just stepped onto a battlefield he could not even begin to comprehend. The silent war had been declared, and I was going to ensure that he lost everything. True wealth is not measured by the balance in your bank account, but by the lengths you will go to protect the people you love. Predators will always exist, wearing tailored suits and charming smiles, constantly searching for kindness to exploit. Never let your desire for a peaceful family blind you to the glaring red flags right in front of you. Always trust your instincts. When someone shows you their true character in the shadows, believe them immediately. Money can buy influence, but its greatest power lies in its profound ability to completely dismantle those who operate in shadows. I took a slow, deep breath and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The sudden, dull thud of the wood hitting the wall made both men jump. Tristan spun around so fast his elbow knocked against the mahogany desk, spilling a few drops of his expensive scotch onto the floor. Bradley took a massive step backward, shrinking into the dark corners of the library, as if he wanted the walls to swallow him whole. For a fraction of a second, I saw raw, unfiltered panic in Tristan's eyes. He knew he was caught. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by the terrified stare of a cornered animal. I walked slowly toward them. I kept my face entirely blank, masking the violent rage that was currently burning through my veins. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat world of Dallas commercial real estate by showing your hand. You let your opponent sweat. "Richard, sir," Tristan stammered. He frantically tried to compose himself, wiping the spilled liquor from his suit jacket. "We were just admiring the architecture in here. The craftsmanship is incredible." I stopped a few feet away from him. I did not look at the ceiling or the walls. I kept my eyes locked dead onto his. "I heard you," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an anvil. I heard exactly what you called my daughter. I heard your brilliant exit strategy to Miami. I heard the name Lexi. The silence in the room became suffocating. Bradley looked physically sick, his hands trembling as he gripped his glass. I waited for Tristan to apologize. I waited for him to beg, to drop to his knees and plead for forgiveness. But Tristan possessed the slick, practiced speed of a career con artist. I watched his mind work, racing through 1,000 calculations, searching for a lifeline in the middle of a hurricane. And within seconds, he found one. He forced a laugh. It was not a nervous laugh, but a condescending, patronizing one. He shook his head, looking at me as if I were a confused old man who had simply misheard a joke. Richard, you completely misunderstood. I swear to you. On my life. Tristan stepped forward, holding his empty hands up defensively. We were not talking about Natalie. Good God, why would you even think that? We were talking about a client, a female investor from Chicago, who has been breathing down my neck for the past 3 weeks. She is a massive cash cow for my technology firm, but she is incredibly demanding, desperate, and clingy. Bradley was just joking that I should date her to secure the venture capital we need for the next quarter. I told him I would rather chew glass. I would never, ever speak about Natalie that way. She is my entire world. It was a flawless lie. It was invented in a split second and delivered with terrifying sincerity. He even managed to look slightly offended, projecting the perfect amount of wounded pride. If I did not know the dark souls of men like him, if I had not spent my entire life negotiating with corporate sharks who could lie while staring at a crucifix, I might have actually believed him. I stared at him, analyzing the subtle shifts in his posture. His shoulders were slightly too rigid. His breathing was just a fraction too fast. He was a predator, trying to hide in plain sight. I tightened my grip on my own glass, ready to verbally tear his pathetic alibi apart. I was going to demand to see his phone. I was going to demand the name of this imaginary Chicago investor. I was prepared to ruin him right there, on the Persian rug. Before I could utter a single word, the library doors swung open wider. The tension in the room instantly fractured. There you are, a bright, cheerful voice called out. Natalie walked in. She was radiant, her face flushed with genuine happiness. She wore a stunning white silk dress I had bought for her in Paris just a month ago. At 30 years old, she was already a highly respected pediatrician at the city hospital. She spent her days working grueling 14-hour shifts, saving premature babies, and comforting terrified parents. She possessed a heart far too pure for the ruthless reality of my world. She believed in the inherent goodness of people. She believed she had found her prince charming. She glided across the room and wrapped her arms around Tristan from behind, resting her chin softly on his shoulder. "What are my 2 favorite men discussing in here?" she asked, looking back and forth between us with a warm, trusting smile. Tristan placed his hand over hers. He kissed her cheek with a display of nauseating tenderness. "Just business, sweetheart," he murmured softly. "Your father and I were just having a quiet moment, discussing some startup strategies." He looked up at me. Over Natalie's shoulder, I saw a challenging, arrogant smirk return to his lips. It was subtle, meant only for me to see. He had just pulled his human shield into the crossfire. His eyes dared me to call him a liar, right there in front of the woman who adored him. "Break her heart right now," his smirk seemed to say. "Destroy her perfect night. Let us see who she believes." My mind raced. If I told her the truth right then, without hard proof, it would be my word against his. Tristan would spin the narrative immediately. He would tell her that her wealthy, controlling father was trying to sabotage her happiness. He would claim I was paranoid, that I thought no one was ever good enough for my only daughter. Natalie would be devastated, caught in the middle of an ugly war. I could alienate her. I could push her right into his waiting arms. I looked at my daughter. I saw the absolute trust in her eyes. I saw the joy radiating from her smile. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was holding on to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a bank account. I had to protect her, but I could not do it blindly. I needed concrete evidence. I needed financial records, text messages, and proof of this woman named Lexi. I needed to peel back his life, layer by layer, until there was nowhere left for him to hide. Just business, I repeated slowly. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I matched his arrogant smile with a cold, dead stare. You boys go back and enjoy the party. I need to make a phone call to close a deal. Tristan nodded, his confidence fully restored. He thought he had won the encounter. He thought I had accepted his miserable lie. He took Natalie's hand and led her toward the door. Do not work too late, Dad, Natalie said, blowing me a kiss. We need you out there for the toasts. I will be right there, sweetheart, I promised. The psychological war had officially begun, and I would destroy his life. I turned my back on the library doors and walked briskly down the grand hallway toward my private office. My heart was hammering against my ribs, echoing in my ears like a war drum. The physical toll of suppressing that level of violent, explosive rage was absolutely exhausting. Every instinct in my body had screamed at me to grab Tristan by his lapels and throw him through the stained glass windows. But you do not build a commercial real estate empire in Dallas by giving in to your primal urges. You build it by maintaining total control when everyone else expects you to break. I stepped into my office, locked the heavy mahogany door behind me, and walked over to the concealed wall safe. I entered the combination, the mechanical clicks sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside the safe was a secure, encrypted cell phone. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed a number I only used when a situation required absolute, ruthless discretion. The line rang twice before a gruff, alert voice answered. Derek, I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and cold. It is Richard Caldwell. I apologize for calling so late on a weekend, but I need your services immediately. Derek Shaw was a former corporate espionage specialist who had transitioned into high-stakes private investigation. He was a man who lived exclusively in the shadows and specialized in tearing down the pristine facades of powerful, deceitful people. Mr. Caldwell, Derek replied, his voice completely devoid of surprise. It is never too late for my best client. What exactly do you need? I paced the length of the office, staring out the large window that overlooked the rear gardens. It is regarding Tristan Pierce, the man who is currently downstairs, celebrating his engagement to my only daughter. He claims to be the founder and chief executive officer of a technology startup called Aeroch Solutions. He boasts that the company is valued at $20 million and is preparing for a major funding round. I want you to peel him like an onion, Derek. I want you to tear his entire life apart, piece by piece. Start with the business. I want to see incorporation documents, tax returns, and comprehensive client lists. I want to know if Aeroch Solutions actually produces a single piece of software, or if it is just a hollow shell company designed to attract gullible investors. I will pull the corporate filings tonight, Derek said smoothly. The sound of a keyboard clicking was already audible in the background. What else? Dig into his personal finances, I instructed, my voice hardening. Find his offshore accounts. Pull his credit reports from every major bureau. Find out exactly who he owes money to, and precisely how much. Look for any outstanding loans, private equity debts, or unsavory financial obligations. A man who plots to steal a trust fund is usually a desperate man running from something massive. I want to know exactly what is chasing him. I paused, letting the next critical piece of information settle in my mind. And Derek, there is one more thing. I need you to find a woman named Lexi. She currently lives in Miami. I do not have a last name, but Tristan mentioned her tonight. I want her phone logs, her travel history, and her exact connection to my future son-in-law. I want to know what he eats for breakfast and where he spends every single dime. I need a comprehensive, bulletproof dossier, and I need it yesterday. Consider it done, sir, Derek replied calmly. I will have a preliminary report securely delivered to your desk within 48 hours. I hung up the phone and placed it back into the safe. The wheels were finally in motion. Derek would find the truth. He always did. As I stood alone in the quiet office, the adrenaline slowly began to recede, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. I looked over at a framed photograph sitting on my desk. It was a picture of my late wife, Evelyn, holding a very young Natalie. Evelyn had been the absolute light of my life. She possessed a warmth and a gentle spirit that I could never quite replicate. Before she passed away, she made it her life's mission to teach Natalie how to see the good in everyone. She taught our daughter to nurture empathy, to offer grace, and to trust in the better nature of humanity. That profound empathy was what made Natalie such an exceptional pediatrician today. It made her a wonderful, deeply caring human being. But right now, in the cruelest twist of fate imaginable, that exact same empathy was being weaponized against her. Tristan had recognized her pure heart and viewed it merely as a vulnerability to be exploited. He was using my late wife's greatest and most beautiful lesson to blind my daughter to his true predatory nature. He was banking on the fact that Natalie would never suspect the man she loved of harboring such a dark, calculated, and malicious agenda. The thought of Tristan using Evelyn's legacy to steal my daughter's future ignited a new, colder fire inside me. I was not just going to stop a wedding, I was going to obliterate him entirely. But to do that, I had to execute the hardest part of the night. I had to leave the sanctuary of my office song, return to the garden party, and play the role of the proud, supportive father. I had to smile at the man who viewed my family as nothing more than a financial target. I had to shake his hand and make him believe that his pathetic lie about the Chicago investor had worked flawlessly. If I showed even a hint of hostility or suspicion, Tristan might realize he was under investigation. He might accelerate his plans, try to secure Natalie's assets prematurely, or simply flee before I could trap him. I needed him to feel completely comfortable. I needed him to feel utterly untouchable. I walked into the adjoining private bathroom and splashed freezing cold water on my face. I stared deeply at my reflection in the mirror. I took a slow, methodical breath, smoothing my silk tie and adjusting my tailored suit jacket. I forced the rigid muscles in my face to relax carefully, crafting an expression of relaxed patriarchal warmth. I practiced a soft, welcoming smile. It was a terrifyingly convincing mask. I left the office and made my way down the grand sweeping staircase. The heavy front doors opened, and the warm Texas night air washed over me. The garden was spectacular. Thousands of white roses draped elegantly over the stone archways. The soft glow of the hanging crystal chandeliers illuminated the happy, celebrating faces of my closest friends and colleagues. I navigated through the dense crowd, accepting warm congratulations and shaking hands, flawlessly projecting the image of a man whose greatest joy was seeing his daughter settled and happy. My eyes scanned the manicured lawn until I finally found them. Natalie and Tristan were standing near the towering four-tiered engagement cake. I walked deliberately toward them, my terrifyingly calm smile firmly in place. "Richard," Tristan called out as I approached. He raised his glass of champagne toward me, projecting an aura of relaxed, victorious confidence. "Did you manage to close that important deal on the phone?" I stopped right in front of him. I reached out and clapped him on the shoulder, giving him a firm, reassuring squeeze that communicated nothing but fatherly approval. "I did, Tristan," I said smoothly. "It took a bit of complex maneuvering, but the trap is officially set. The target has absolutely no idea what is coming." Tristan laughed aloud, completely missing the dark, literal, double meaning of my words. "That is exactly why you are a legend in this city, Richard. You are always one step ahead of the competition." Natalie beamed, linking her arm affectionately through mine. "I am so incredibly glad you are done working for the night, Dad. The event coordinator is about to ask everyone to gather for the toasts. We really need you up there." I looked down at my beautiful, trusting daughter, my heart aching with the massive secret I was forced to carry. "I would not miss it for the world, sweetheart," I said softly. I turned my gaze back to Tristan, my smile never wavering. "Let us go celebrate your future." The transition from the garden party to the Sunday dinner felt like a slow march toward the edge of a jagged cliff. Tradition dictated that we gather at my estate every Sunday evening for a formal family meal. It was a cherished ritual my late wife Evelyn had started decades ago, designed to keep us grounded no matter how chaotic our professional lives became. I had always looked forward to these dinners, but tonight, the massive mahogany dining table felt like a psychological battlefield. The crystal glassware clinked softly. The polished silver gleamed under the warm light of the chandelier, and my blood simmered just below the surface. Natalie sat to my right, looking radiant and completely at ease, her delicate hand resting affectionately over Tristan's on the pristine white tablecloth. Tristan sat directly across from me. He wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, exuding the relaxed, effortless charm of a man who firmly believed he held all the winning cards in a rigged game. He spent the first 20 minutes of the meal holding court, regaling Natalie and my household staff with grandiose tales of his supposed corporate conquests. He spoke fluidly about market disruption, leveraging synergistic paradigms, and revolutionizing the cloud infrastructure landscape. He confidently used every hollow buzzword in the Silicon Valley dictionary, painting a picture of massive success. Natalie watched him with absolute adoration, her eyes shining with immense pride as she listened to the man she believed was a visionary genius. I sat quietly at the head of the table, cutting my steak with slow, deliberate precision. I let him talk. I let him build his imaginary empire out of thin air. Over the past 40 years, I had negotiated with some of the most ruthless, brilliant, and deceptive corporate sharks in the United States. I had sat across from aggressive men who could bankrupt a major city without blinking an eye. Through those decades, I had learned to read micro-expressions long before behavioral experts ever wrote books about them. I knew the exact difference between the confident stillness of a man telling the absolute truth and the hyperactive performance of a man selling a desperate, manufactured lie. Tristan was performing. His gestures were slightly too broad and sweeping. His laughter was a fraction too loud. He was constantly checking Natalie's face for validation, ensuring his human shield was still firmly in place and completely mesmerized. When the dessert plates were cleared away and the fresh coffee was poured, I decided it was time to apply the pressure. I folded my linen napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the table. "Tristan," I said, my voice rich with a grandfatherly curiosity that perfectly masked the lethal trap I was laying. "I have been thinking a lot about your technology firm, Aeroch Solutions." "Correct. You mentioned briefly at the engagement party, that you are preparing for a massive Series B funding round. Tristan smiled broadly, taking a confident sip of his black coffee. That is exactly right, Richard. We are poised for truly exponential growth this quarter. The market indicators are incredibly strong right now, and our proprietary algorithms are drawing a lot of serious attention from major coastal investors. That is wonderful news, I replied smoothly, maintaining my warm expression. I have always admired the rapid agility of the technology sector. It is quite different from the slow grind of commercial real estate. Out of pure professional curiosity, how exactly are you structuring your capitalization table ahead of this new round? Are you dealing with participating preferred stock or standard convertible notes? Because I know firsthand how aggressive those venture capital firms can be regarding anti-dilution provisions. If you are not extremely careful with your current burn rate, they could easily trigger a down round and completely wipe out your founder equity before you even go public. The change in his demeanor was instantaneous, though completely invisible to the untrained eye. Natalie simply took a sip of her sparkling water, entirely oblivious to the heavy financial terminology being exchanged. But Tristan understood exactly what I was doing. I was not asking a polite fatherly question over dessert. I was demanding proof of life for his phantom company. For a fraction of a second, his charismatic mask slipped and shattered. I watched the pupil of his left eye dilate in sudden alarm. I saw the tiny, tight muscle in his jaw locked defensively. A microscopic bead of sweat manifested right at his hairline, catching the light of the chandelier. His brain was desperately scrambling, trying to search a mental database of business jargon that simply did not exist. He had thoroughly prepared for basic questions about apps, servers, and software development. He had not prepared for the brutal, granular mechanics of high-level venture capital financing. That is a very insightful question, Richard, Tristan finally said. His voice remained remarkably steady, but the pitch was half an octave higher than it had been a moment ago. We are currently consulting heavily with our legal team in Delaware to ensure the capitalization table is completely optimized for the new investors. We are leaning toward a hybrid model to protect our early seed investors while maintaining our aggressive growth metrics. The specifics are a bit legally dense at the moment, and I am strictly bound by non-disclosure agreements. But I assure you, we have top-tier representation handling all the complicated mechanics. It was a masterful, desperate dodge. He used a massive word salad to say absolutely nothing, wrapping his profound ignorance in the impenetrable, convenient armor of a non-disclosure agreement. To Natalie, it sounded like the prudent, responsible answer of a brilliant chief executive officer protecting his assets. To me, it sounded exactly like a dying man desperately grasping at a broken branch as he fell down a cliff. Of course, I smiled, leaning back slowly in my leather chair. Discretion is paramount in any serious business. I would never ask you to violate a strict confidentiality agreement. I merely wanted to ensure you were properly protecting your assets. It would be a terrible, devastating shame to see you build such a magnificent company only to have ruthless, greedy investors steal it right out from under you. The dark double meaning of my words hung heavily in the tense air between us. Tristan swallowed hard. His throat bobbed nervously. He reached blindly for his water glass, his knuckles turning completely white as he gripped the heavy crystal. He took a long, slow drink, trying to buy himself another few precious seconds of composure before he had to speak again. Tristan works so incredibly hard, Dad, Natalie chimed in, completely misreading the sudden, suffocating tension in the dining room. She reached out and squeezed his arm affectionately. I tell him all the time he needs to take a real break. Once the wedding is over and the funding round is finally secured, I am making him turn off his phone for 2 entire weeks on our honeymoon. I am really looking forward to it, sweetheart, Tristan managed to say, offering her a tight, visibly strained smile that did not reach his panicked eyes. The conversation naturally drifted away from business, gently steered by Natalie's cheerful, continuous updates about the floral arrangements and the final seating chart for the upcoming reception. I contributed to the wedding chatter with perfect, flawless paternal enthusiasm. I nodded at all the right times. I laughed warmly at all the right jokes. I played the role of the wealthy, supportive patriarch without a single noticeable flaw. But underneath the polite pleasantries and the fine dining, the dynamic in the room had fundamentally and permanently altered. Tristan was no longer holding court with supreme arrogance. He was no longer the relaxed, untouchable predator who had so casually mocked my daughter in my private library. He was sitting rigidly upright in his chair, mindlessly picking at his remaining food, his eyes constantly and nervously darting toward me across the table. He knew. He did not know exactly what I had heard the previous night. He did not know that I had already hired a ruthless private investigator to systematically dismantle his entire existence. But he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was testing him. He recognized the cold, calculating, and unforgiving intelligence hidden directly behind my grandfatherly smile. He finally realized that the clueless, trusting old man he had so confidently planned to exploit was actually a veteran apex predator who had just caught his scent. As the evening finally drew to a close, and we stood together by the grand entrance to say our goodbyes, Tristan extended his hand toward me. His palm was slightly clammy against my skin. "Thank you for a truly wonderful dinner, Richard," he said, forcing himself to maintain direct eye contact. "It is always a pleasure to have you here, Tristan," I replied, making sure my grip on his hand was just a fraction tighter than necessary. "Drive safely tonight. You have a very big, unpredictable future ahead of you." I stood silently on the porch and watched his car disappear down the long, sweeping driveway of my estate into the dark night. The psychological war had officially escalated from the shadows directly into the light. I had fired the very first warning shot straight across his bow, and now the invisible clock was loudly ticking. Tristan Pierce was panicked, and panicked. Desperate men always make catastrophic mistakes. I just had to be perfectly ready to catch him when he inevitably fell. The psychological warfare of that Sunday dinner was only the beginning of a long week. I spent 3 days maintaining the flawless illusion of a happy father. I approved floral arrangements. I even allowed Tristan to join me for a brief round of golf, letting him win by 2 strokes to artificially inflate his fragile ego. He played the part of the respectful future son-in-law to perfection, but I could see the underlying tension radiating from his posture. The invisible walls were closing in, and he felt the pressure building. On Thursday morning, the waiting came to an abrupt end. I was sitting at my oak desk when my secure line rang. It was the front desk security guard. Derek Shaw was on his way up. I closed my laptop and waited. 2 minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my office swung open. Derek walked straight across the room, carrying a thick manila folder under his arm. His expression was completely grim, devoid of his usual professional detachment. "You were absolutely right to trust your gut on this one, Richard," Derek said, dropping the heavy folder directly onto my desk. "The kid is a walking fraud, but the reality is significantly worse than we anticipated." I leaned forward, pulling the folder toward me. I opened the cover and stared at a mountain of financial spreadsheets, offshore bank statements, and printed photographs. "Talk to me, Derek," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Tell me exactly what I am looking at." Derek planted his hands firmly on the outer edge of my solid oak desk. "Let us start with his magnificent technology empire," he began, tapping a stack of incorporation documents. "Aerotech Solutions does not exist. It is a completely hollow shell company, with no proprietary software, no engineering team, and zero functional product. The only thing he possesses is a rented virtual office space in Austin. The entire venture is a meticulously crafted mirage. I stared at the stark proof of his deception. A cold weight began to settle deep in my stomach. So he is a con artist, I said slowly. He has been selling smoke and mirrors to finance a lavish lifestyle. If only it were just a simple con, Derek replied, shaking his head grimly. Pulling off a con requires capital, and Tristan ran out of his own money 3 years ago. He is currently $4 million in debt. $4 million, I repeated, my eyes widening slightly as I scanned the highlighted financial ledgers. To who? Derek separated 2 stacks of paper. It is a highly volatile financial mix, he explained. The first $2 million is owed to a private equity firm based out of New York. They gave him seed money based on fraudulent revenue projections. They recently discovered the discrepancy and are preparing to sue him for criminal fraud. They are going directly after his personal assets. And the other $2 million? I asked, feeling the air in the office grow thin. Derek took a slow, deliberate breath. That is where the situation becomes incredibly dangerous. The other $2 million is owed to a syndicate of loan sharks operating out of Las Vegas. These are violent, unpredictable men who break kneecaps and burn houses down. Tristan is severely delinquent on his payments. They have been breathing down his neck for months. I stared at the financial documents in absolute horror. The narrative in my head violently shifted. Tristan was not just a greedy parasite looking for a comfortable early retirement. He was a desperate, drowning rat. He had targeted Natalie because her $3 million trust fund was the only life raft capable of saving him from a violent end. He needed her money to pay off the syndicate before they destroyed him. The only reason he is still walking around in one piece, Derek continued softly, is because he showed those Vegas lenders the receipt for the engagement ring. He promised them that he was marrying into the Caldwell commercial real estate empire. He bought himself a few weeks of grace by using your family name as collateral. The sheer audacity of his plan made my blood boil. He leveraged my daughter to save himself. What else, Derek? I demanded. You mentioned a woman in Miami. Derek reached into the manila folder and pulled out a photograph, sliding it carefully across the desk. It showed Tristan standing on the deck of a luxury yacht in Miami. He was holding a glass of champagne, his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a stunning blonde woman. That is Lexi, Derek stated simply. She is a 24-year-old social media model. He has been secretly wiring her $30,000 a month for the past year to maintain her lavish lifestyle in Florida. He uses an offshore account in the Bahamas to hide the transactions from his current creditors. I looked closely at the photograph, analyzing every detail. The woman was beautiful, but there was something else. She was wearing a form-fitting sundress, and her stomach was very visibly rounded. I pointed a trembling finger at the photograph. Is she pregnant? Derek nodded. Yes, she is 4 months pregnant. According to the medical records I managed to acquire, it is a boy. Tristan is the registered father. He is actively starting an entirely new family in Florida, using the money he intends to steal from Natalie. I sat back in my heavy leather chair. The silence in the office was absolute and incredibly heavy. The picture was complete. The scope of his betrayal was so massive, so profoundly evil, that it almost defied human comprehension. He was planning to marry my pure, trusting daughter, drain her entire financial future to satisfy his violent creditors, and then abandon her to raise a child with his mistress in Miami. He had reduced Natalie to a mere financial transaction. I closed my eyes for a long moment, organizing the chaotic storm of fury into a cold, sharpened weapon. I could not allow him to walk away. I had to completely annihilate his ability to ever harm anyone again. I had to strip him of every single resource he possessed. "Derek," I said, opening my eyes and looking at the investigator with a gaze that held absolutely no mercy. "I want you to gather every single piece of contact information for the private equity firm in New York and the lending syndicate in Las Vegas. Find me the names of their primary decision-makers. Do not make contact with them yourself. Just give me the numbers." Derek looked at me, a glimmer of deep understanding flashing in his eyes. "You are not just going to break off the engagement, are you?" "No," I replied, picking up the photograph of Tristan and his pregnant mistress. "Violence is a cheap, temporary solution. I am going to buy his debt. I am going to become his sole creditor. And then I am going to bury him so deeply in financial ruin that he will never see the light of day again. Get Gregory Hughes on the line immediately. It is time to set a trap." I sat perfectly still as Derek left the office, leaving me alone with the devastating truth scattered across my desk. I reached for my phone to call Gregory Hughes, fully intending to begin the process of purchasing Tristan's massive debt. I was ready to become his worst nightmare. But before I could even dial the number, my private office line rang. The caller identification displayed a name that made my chest tighten. It was Natalie. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing the sharp edges of anger from my voice, and answered the call. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. "How is your morning going at the hospital?" "It has been incredibly hectic, Dad," Natalie replied. Her voice sounded exhausted, but undeniably happy. "We had 3 premature deliveries before noon, but everyone is stable now. I am actually taking a rare break. I wanted to know if you had time to grab a quick lunch with me near the clinic. There is something important I need to run past you." The word "important" triggered an immediate blaring alarm in my mind. "Of course," I told her. "I will be there in 20 minutes." I gathered the damning photographs and financial ledgers, locking them securely back inside my wall safe. I left my building and drove across downtown Dallas, my mind racing through a dozen terrible scenarios. When I arrived at the quiet, upscale cafe near the hospital, Natalie was already sitting at a corner table. She was wearing her white medical coat over a simple blue dress, looking so much like her late mother that it physically ached to look at her. I sat down across from her, offering a warm, patriarchal smile. "What is on your mind, sweetheart?" I asked, ordering a black coffee from the passing waiter. "Is everything all right with the wedding preparations?" "Everything is perfect, Dad," she beamed, resting her hands on the table. "Actually, it is about our financial future. Tristan has been so incredibly proactive lately. He met with a specialized estate planner yesterday, and he came to me with a really brilliant idea." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I kept my smile absolutely frozen in place. "Is that right?" I asked smoothly. "What kind of idea did Tristan propose?" Natalie leaned forward, her eyes shining with absolute trust and admiration. She explained that Tristan was deeply concerned about protecting her assets. He told her that because his technology firm was entering a high valuation phase ahead of a massive funding round, he wanted to completely shield her trust fund from any potential corporate liabilities. He suggested that by signing a joint asset amendment to their prenuptial agreement, they could merge their portfolios under a specific legal umbrella. He claimed this maneuver would not only protect her money, but also drastically optimize their combined tax bracket, saving them millions in the long run. My stomach violently twisted. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. Tristan had taken a highly aggressive legal maneuver and wrapped it in the comforting guise of love and protection. He was weaponizing his fake success to blind her. I knew exactly what that specific legal umbrella actually meant. It was a collateral access mechanism. The absolute second Natalie signed that amendment, her isolated trust fund would become a joint marital asset. Tristan would gain the immediate, unrestricted legal right to borrow against her $3 million. He would use her money to pay off the violent Las Vegas loan sharks who were currently hunting him down, leaving my daughter holding the bag for his criminal debts. That sounds very complex, I said carefully, maintaining a tone of mild fatherly curiosity. When exactly are you planning to execute this amendment? This afternoon, Natalie replied casually, taking a sip of her iced tea. We have an appointment with the notary at 4 o'clock. Tristan said, it is better to get the paperwork out of the way now, so we can just focus entirely on the wedding next week. I glanced at my watch. It was currently 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I had exactly 3 hours to stop my daughter from signing her entire future over to a desperate, drowning predator. My first instinct was to slam my fist onto the table and scream the truth. I wanted to tell her about the loan sharks, the fake company, and the pregnant mistress living in Miami. But I remembered the absolute adoration in her eyes. I remembered how deeply she loved this man. If I destroyed her illusion right here in a public cafe, without easing her into the reality, the shock might break her completely. Furthermore, if she confronted Tristan with my accusations, he would immediately realize I was investigating him. He would panic, flee the state, and avoid the devastating, inescapable trap I was currently building for him. I needed to stall the signing, but I had to do it using a lie of my own. Natalie, sweetheart, I began, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I was actually hoping to keep this a complete secret until the rehearsal dinner. But you are forcing my hand early. Natalie looked confused, her brow furrowed slightly. Keep what a secret, Dad. I reached across the small table and gently squeezed her hands. I am preparing a massive financial wedding gift for the two of you. I lied seamlessly, channeling 40 years of boardroom acting. It involves a very complex transfer of commercial real estate assets into your primary trust fund. My legal team has been working on the transfer for weeks. If you sign any joint asset amendments today, it will completely alter your tax classification. Doing so would trigger massive, immediate federal tax penalties on the gift I am trying to give you. It would be a catastrophic logistical nightmare. Natalie's eyes widened in genuine surprise. Dad, you do not have to give us anything else. You are already paying for this entire beautiful wedding. I want to do this, I insisted, pouring every ounce of fatherly love I possessed into my gaze. But I need a very big favor from you. I need you to leave your trust fund entirely untouched and unmended for the next 30 days. Let my attorneys finish their work. Once the wedding is over and the dust settles, you and Tristan can restructure your taxes however you see fit. Can you do that for me? Can you postpone the signing? Natalie smiled warmly, deeply touched by my fabricated generosity. She squeezed my hands back. Of course, Dad. I had no idea you were doing all of that. I will text Tristan right now and tell him we need to cancel the appointment with the notary. She pulled her mobile phone from her purse and quickly typed out a message. I sat perfectly still, watching her screen. Less than 30 seconds later, 3 gray typing dots appeared. Tristan was responding. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that digital connection. Tristan was sitting somewhere in the city, sweating profusely, staring at his phone, in sheer, unadulterated panic. His violent creditors were demanding their money, and his guaranteed lifeline had just been snatched away at the very last possible second. He says the lawyer is going to charge us a cancellation fee, she told me, typing her response. I just told him it does not matter, and that we absolutely must wait until after the honeymoon. He is a little disappointed because he wanted everything perfectly organized, but he says he understands completely. I took a slow, steady sip of my black coffee, masking the cold, predatory satisfaction that was currently flooding my veins. Tristan did not understand at all. He was simply terrified. He had tried to launch a preemptive strike to steal my daughter's wealth, and he had failed. He was now backed securely into a corner with absolutely no way out. The Las Vegas syndicate would not wait until after the honeymoon. They wanted their $2 million immediately. I finished my lunch with my beautiful daughter, listening to her talk excitedly about her dress fittings and the upcoming honeymoon to the Maldives. Every time she smiled, my resolve hardened into solid steel. I walked her back to the entrance of the pediatric clinic, kissing her gently on the forehead, before watching her disappear through the sliding glass doors. Once she was completely out of sight, I pulled my secure phone from my breast pocket. The time for defensive maneuvering had officially ended. It was time to go on the offensive. I dialed the number for Gregory Hughes, my primary corporate attorney, as I walked briskly back to my waiting car. "Gregory," I said the moment he answered, "I need you to draft a highly specialized investment contract immediately. We are going to offer Tristan Pierce $10 million, but the terms need to be absolutely lethal. I want a blanket lien placed on every single asset he currently possesses." I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The trap was finally ready. I sat in the isolation of my vehicle for several minutes. The steady hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. My corporate attorney was already moving, with ruthless efficiency, to draft the lethal investment contract. But the feeling of absolute control was suddenly shattered by a sharp vibration from my secure phone. It was Derek. The private investigator had just intercepted a highly alarming digital communication. Tristan was not accepting the delay. My daughter had texted him earlier to cancel their afternoon appointment with the estate planner, but Tristan was far too desperate to simply take no for an answer. The violent lending syndicate in Las Vegas had just issued him a strict, non-negotiable deadline. He needed liquid collateral immediately. Derek informed me that Tristan had secretly dispatched a mobile notary directly to the pediatric clinic. He was planning to ambush Natalie between her patient consultations. He intended to pressure her into signing the joint asset amendment under the guise of a last-minute wedding emergency. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his plan made my jaw clench so tightly, my teeth actually ached. He was actively trying to bypass my intervention and manipulate her in her own workplace. I shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, merging aggressively into the heavy downtown traffic. I drove toward the city hospital with a singular icy focus. I navigated the familiar congested streets of Dallas, my mind calculating every possible variable. I had to reach the clinic before that notary did. I had to protect her without exposing the ugly, horrifying truth just yet. When I finally arrived at the sprawling medical complex, I bypassed the main visitor parking and left my vehicle in the restricted executive zone. I walked swiftly through the automatic sliding glass doors, the sterile scent of antiseptic immediately filling my lungs. The pediatric wing was located on the third floor of the main building. I stepped out of the elevator into a bright, bustling corridor painted in soft, comforting pastel colors. The stark contrast between this nurturing environment and the dark, predatory world Tristan inhabited was incredibly jarring. This was a sanctuary of healing and pure innocence. I walked toward the central nurses' station and paused. Through the large viewing window of a specialized treatment room, I saw my beautiful daughter. Natalie was sitting on a low stool beside a small hospital bed. She was speaking softly to a pale, frightened little boy holding a stuffed animal. I watched as she gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her face radiating an absolute boundless compassion. She smiled at the exhausted parents standing nearby, offering them the kind of genuine, profound reassurance that no amount of money could ever possibly buy. My chest swelled with an overwhelming protective pride. My late wife had raised a truly magnificent human being. Natalie possessed a soul so incredibly bright and giving that it naturally attracted people to her. But that same beautiful light had also attracted a dangerous parasite. Tristan did not love her. He did not value her brilliant mind or her boundless empathy. He only saw a gullible target, a convenient vehicle to clear his massive gambling debts and fund a lavish lifestyle with his pregnant mistress in Miami. Watching her care for those sick children, any lingering trace of paternal hesitation completely evaporated from my mind. My internal resolve turned to absolute unforgiving ice. Simply breaking off the engagement and canceling the extravagant wedding was no longer an acceptable outcome. Removing Tristan from her life would keep her safe for now, but it would not balance the cosmic scales of justice. If I simply chased him away, he would just find another trusting, wealthy woman to exploit. He would continue to ruin innocent lives, leaving a massive trail of financial and emotional devastation in his wake. I decided in that very moment that I must completely annihilate his ability to ever harm anyone again. I would strip him of his freedom, his reputation, and his entire future. I turned my attention away from the treatment room, just as a man in a cheap gray suit stepped off the elevator. He carried a thick leather briefcase and looked nervously around the busy pediatric ward. I recognized the predatory shuffle immediately. It was the mobile notary Tristan had sent. I intercepted him before he could even approach the main reception desk. I stepped directly into his path, blocking his line of sight to my daughter's clinic. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who owned half the commercial buildings in the downtown business district. "You are looking for Dr. Natalie Caldwell." The notary blinked in surprise, clearly intimidated by my sudden, imposing presence. "Yes, sir," he stammered slightly, shifting his briefcase. "I have some urgent legal documents requiring her immediate signature regarding a prenuptial amendment." I reached out and firmly placed my hand on his shoulder, turning him smoothly back toward the waiting elevators. "I am Richard Caldwell," I stated simply, letting the weight of my name settle over him. "I am her father. My daughter is treating critically ill children, and I will not allow her to be interrupted for any reason. Furthermore, those documents you are carrying are no longer valid. My legal team is restructuring the financial arrangement for a corporate gift. If my daughter signs those papers today, it will trigger catastrophic federal tax penalties. You will return to whoever hired you and inform them the signing is indefinitely postponed. Do you understand me?" The notary swallowed hard, recognizing he was entirely out of his depth. He nodded quickly, backing into the elevator without uttering a single word of protest. I watched the doors slide shut, eliminating the threat. I took a deep breath and walked to the treatment room. Natalie stepped out a few minutes later, looking tired but deeply fulfilled. She looked up and gasped in pleasant surprise. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, pulling me into a warm hug. "I just wanted to see my favorite doctor," I replied smoothly, returning her embrace. "And I wanted to personally ensure you successfully canceled that notary appointment. My banking team is working around the clock to finalize your wedding gift, and we cannot risk legal complications right now." Natalie smiled, shaking her head affectionately. "You are entirely too much, Dad." "Yes, I told Tristan we must wait. He pushed back earlier, saying the notary was already here, but I was firm. I told him, 'My patients come first, and your gift requires absolute patience.'" I kissed her forehead, masking the satisfaction in my chest. "You are a smart woman, sweetheart," I murmured. I walked her toward the break room, listening to her phone chime incessantly in her pocket. It was Tristan, desperately trying to salvage his collapsing lifeline. But he was too late. I had severed his access to her trust fund. He was now completely isolated, drowning in violent debt, and desperate for a miracle. Tomorrow, I would invite him to my office and offer the exact miracle he was looking for. The next morning arrived, with a heavy, oppressive heat that Dallas was famous for. I stepped into the private elevator of my downtown headquarters at exactly 7 o'clock. The quiet hum of the machinery, lifting me 40 floors above the city, matched the calculated rhythm of my thoughts. I was not just going to stop a wedding today. I was going to surgically dismantle a predator who thought he could use my family as a financial shield. When the doors parted to my expansive executive suite, Gregory Hughes was already waiting for me. In the private boardroom, spread across the long mahogany table, was a stack of dense, intimidating documents. I poured myself a black coffee and took a seat opposite him. Gregory pushed the thickest folder toward me. "It is exactly as you requested, Richard," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "This is a 50-page investment agreement for a $10 million capital injection into Arachach Solutions. The financial language is standard for a mezzanine funding round, but the collateral clauses, buried in Section 4, are absolutely draconian. We have included a comprehensive blanket lien. If Tristan Pierce accepts this money, he is legally pledging his company, his personal bank accounts, his luxury vehicles, his condominium, and any future earnings as collateral. Furthermore, there is an immediate default trigger. If he commits any act of moral turpitude, fraud, or extortion, the entire debt becomes payable on demand. If he defaults, you have the unilateral right to seize every single asset he owns without prolonged litigation." I flipped through the dense pages of legal terminology. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. A legitimate businessman would never sign a document like this without a team of aggressive lawyers spending a month tearing it apart. But Tristan was not a legitimate businessman. He was a terrified, drowning con artist who owed $2 million to violent loan sharks. He needed liquid capital to save his life, and he needed it before the wedding. He was entirely out of time. "Thank you, Gregory," the first murmured, closing the folder. "Have security clear Mr. Pierce for entry. I am expecting him at 10 o'clock. I kept my tone incredibly warm on the phone, playing the role of the proud, supportive patriarch to absolute perfection. I told him I had a massive surprise regarding his upcoming nuptials and insisted he come to my office alone. When Tristan walked through my double doors 3 hours later, the physical toll of his secret panic was remarkably evident. The skin around his eyes was tight, and his posture lacked the effortless, arrogant swagger he had displayed in my library just days ago. The failed notary ambush at the pediatric clinic had clearly terrified him. He knew the Las Vegas syndicate was closing in, and his primary escape route had been temporarily blocked. "Richard, thank you for inviting me," Tristan said, forcing a bright, charismatic smile as he crossed the vast expanse of my office. He extended his hand. "Your assistant mentioned a wedding surprise." I stood up from my desk and shook his hand warmly, completely ignoring the slight clamminess of his palm. "Please, take a seat, Tristan." I walked over to the private bar in the corner of the room. "Can I offer you a drink? Coffee? Something stronger to celebrate?" "Just sparkling water would be fantastic." "Thank you," he replied, sinking into one of the plush leather chairs opposite my desk. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished wood, projecting an aura of complete, unshakable trust. "Tristan," I began softly, my voice dripping with manufactured sincerity, "I owe you an apology. At the engagement party, and even at our Sunday dinner, I was asking some rather aggressive questions about your technology firm. I know I probably came across as a typical overbearing father who thinks no one is good enough for his daughter." "Not at all, Richard. You are protecting your family. I respect that immensely. I would do the exact same thing in your position. I smiled, letting a look of paternal affection wash over my features. Well, your patience and your dedication to Natalie have truly won me over. I see how much she loves you, and I see how incredibly hard you are working to build a Foch Solutions into an industry leader. But I also know the brutal reality of the technology sector. Raising capital for a funding round can be an absolute nightmare. The venture capital firms want to strip you of your equity and control your board of directors. I do not want to see my son-in-law lose the company he built from the ground up just because he needed growth capital. Tristan was staring at me, his breathing shallow. He was hanging on to my every word, his mind racing to comprehend where this conversation was heading. That is why, I continued smoothly, I have decided to step in. I want to ensure you and Natalie start your marriage with absolute financial security. As my personal wedding gift to the two of you, I am going to bypass the venture capital sharks. I am going to personally invest $10 million directly into Aeroch Solutions. The crystal glass slipped slightly in Tristan's hand. He caught it just before it spilled, placing it onto a coaster with trembling fingers. He stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. $10 million. To a man suffocating under a $4 million mountain of lethal debt, I had just offered the ultimate salvation. Richard, he stammered, his polished facade cracking under the sheer weight of his greed. I am speechless. That is an incredibly generous offer. I do not even know what to say to you right now. You do not have to say anything, I replied cheerfully. You just have to review the paperwork. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the thick 50-page contract Gregory had prepared. I dropped it onto the desk. The heavy thud echoed through the quiet office. It was the physical manifestation of his greed, perfectly bound in premium leather folders. There is just one small catch, I explained, waving my hand dismissively, as if the contract were nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle. Because this is a massive transfer of personal capital, my legal team insisted on some standard protective measures. It is entirely procedural. The contract includes a blanket lien on your business and personal assets. It simply means that until the company hits its projected revenue targets next year, your assets act as collateral for the $10 million. It protects me from federal gift tax liabilities and keeps the corporate auditors happy. Once the wedding is over and the company goes public, we dissolve the lien entirely. Tristan stared down at the massive stack of dense legal paper. His eyes flickered back and forth between the contract and my face. A normal executive would have immediately requested a week to let a legal team analyze every single clause. A legitimate founder would have balked at the idea of pledging his personal condominium and bank accounts for corporate funding. But Tristan was just incredibly desperate. Tristan sat frozen in the chair, opposite my desk, his eyes darting across the first page of the document. He was a predator, accustomed to controlling the narrative, manipulating conversations with easy charm. But right now, sitting in my corporate fortress, he was out of his depth. He touched the paper, tracing the seal. $10 million was a staggering amount of capital. It was enough to silence the loan sharks hunting him down in Las Vegas. It was enough to settle his fraudulent accounts with the equity firm in New York. It was the ultimate escape hatch for a man suffocating under the crushing weight of his lies. But the cost was stepping into a financial cage I had meticulously designed to ruin him. I watched his Adam's apple bobbing against his white collar. He flipped to the fourth section, skimming the paragraphs detailing the blanket lien. I saw his jaw tighten, reading the clauses tying his luxury condominium, vehicles, business assets, and offshore accounts to the funding. Gregory had drafted an agreement so punishing it left no room for negotiation. "Is there a problem, Tristan?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle, patient, and paternal. If you are not entirely comfortable with the collateral requirements, we can delay the investment. I can have Gregory draft a traditional equity split, but that will require a board review. It would take 3 or 4 months to finalize the transfer and pass auditing procedures. I leaned back in my chair and checked my watch, projecting casual indifference. I just thought it would be a wonderful gesture to have the funds secured in your accounts before the wedding next week. It would allow you to focus entirely on my daughter and your honeymoon, instead of worrying about venture capital pitches. The mention of a 4-month delay sent a shockwave through his body. His violent creditors were not going to wait 4 months. They were not even going to wait 4 days. He needed liquid cash immediately to save his kneecaps, or worse, his life. The illusion of his wealthy lifestyle was cracking, and the consequences of his failures were breathing right down his neck. "I do not want to delay anything, Richard," he replied quickly. His voice cracked slightly before he cleared his throat to regain his confident persona. "I am just making sure I understand the mechanics of these default triggers. This language seems unusually aggressive for a family investment. It mentions the immediate seizure of all listed assets without arbitration in the event of moral turpitude or fraudulent behavior." I offered him a reassuring chuckle. "Oh, that is just Gregory being overly protective of my commercial estate," I explained smoothly, waving my hand in a dismissive gesture. "Corporate lawyers always plan for the worst-case scenarios. They are paid to be paranoid. They write those strict clauses to protect my portfolio against hostile tape pile takeovers or criminal negligence. You and I both know that you are a brilliant, highly ethical founder. You love my daughter deeply, and you are building a legitimate enterprise. A moral turpitude clause is only dangerous to a man who plans on committing fraud. Are you planning on committing fraud against me, Tristan?" I smiled warmly at him, my eyes locking directly onto his, with a perfectly manufactured grandfatherly affection. The question hung heavily in the quiet atmosphere of my office. It was a direct, lethal challenge, perfectly wrapped in a polite, conversational joke. If he protested the clause too aggressively, he would immediately signal that he had something dark and criminal to hide. He was completely trapped by his own fabricated successful persona. Tristan forced a laugh that sounded remarkably hollow and strained. "Of course not, Richard. You know, my integrity is my most valuable business asset. I am just accustomed to having my own legal team review corporate documents of this magnitude before executing them. Perhaps I should forward this to my attorneys in Delaware, just for a quick compliance check before we move forward." I shrugged my shoulders, maintaining my flawlessly calm demeanor. "You are absolutely free to do that, Tristan. I would never pressure you into signing a financial contract you have not properly vetted. However, I am leaving for a major commercial symposium in London tomorrow morning. If we do not execute the investment agreement today, my capital will be temporarily tied up in international escrow until I return late next month. The choice is entirely yours. We can wait until I get back." The trap was fully set. The $10 million bait was hanging right in front of his face, and the ticking clock of his own debts was deafening in his ears. I watched the overwhelming greed and the sheer unadulterated terror war within him. He looked down at the 50-page contract sitting on my desk. He looked at the heavy gold pen resting right beside it. I knew exactly what was running through his mind. He did not have a legal team in Delaware. He did not have an innovative software product to protect. He only had the crushing, terrifying reality of a $4 million debt and angry men demanding their money. Tristan reached out and slowly picked up the gold pen. He did not read another word of the contract. He flipped directly to the signature pages, located at the very back of the thick binder. With a hand that trembled ever so slightly, he signed his name on the dotted line. He signed away his luxury condominium. He signed away his expensive cars. He signed away the hidden offshore accounts, holding the money he had stolen from previous investors. He signed away his entire future, legally binding himself to a draconian contract designed exclusively to completely destroy him. I watched the black ink dry on the thick paper, feeling a profound, icy satisfaction settle deep within my chest. I had successfully cornered the predator. "Welcome to the family, Tristan," I said cheerfully. I reached across the wide mahogany desk to shake his hand one final time. He smiled, looking immensely relieved as he set the pen down. "When can I expect the investment funds to be officially wired?" he asked, unable to keep the desperate, gnawing hunger completely out of his voice. I pulled the signed contract toward me and carefully closed the leather cover. "It is a very large transfer," I explained carefully. "Federal banking regulations require a mandatory compliance review for any sudden domestic wire exceeding $5 million. The funds should clear your accounts by next Wednesday, just a few days before the wedding ceremony." I saw the briefest flash of pure, unfiltered panic return to his eyes. Next Wednesday was far too late. He needed the money today. He had just locked himself into my financial cage, but his immediate desperate crisis had not been solved. He stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with shaking fingers. He thanked me profusely before rushing out the heavy oak door. He was completely unaware that his incredibly desperate need for immediate cash was about to drive him to commit the ultimate unforgivable federal crime that would seal his absolute and permanent destruction. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the profound silence of my executive office. Tristan Pierce was currently riding the elevator down to the lobby, clutching a leather-bound contract that he believed was his ultimate salvation. In reality, he was carrying a ticking time bomb. The $10 million investment I had promised him was entirely genuine, but the procedural delay I had fabricated was the true weapon. I had deliberately engineered a window of 5 days where he would be legally bound to my draconian collateral terms, yet remain utterly devoid of the liquid capital he needed to satisfy his violent creditors. I knew exactly how desperate men operated when they were backed into a corner with no viable escape route. They simply reacted to the immediate threat standing directly in front of them. For Tristan, that threat was the Las Vegas lending syndicate. Derek Shaw had informed me earlier that morning that the syndicate had officially lost their patience. They had issued Tristan a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum. He had 48 hours to deliver $2 million, or they were going to start dismantling his life in a very physical, highly irreversible manner. Showing them my signed investment contract might have bought him a few extra days of grace previously, but loan sharks did not accept corporate promises. The following 48 hours were an exercise in supreme psychological endurance, as I went about my normal daily routine with meticulous precision. But beneath that calm exterior, I was waiting for the inevitable fracture. I was waiting for Tristan to realize that the closing walls were going to crush him before my promised wire transfer ever arrived. On Friday afternoon, the fracture finally occurred. I was sitting in my private study at the estate, reviewing a quarterly tax projection, when my secure phone illuminated. The caller identification displayed the name of my primary wealth manager at the Federal Bank, a man named Harrison, who had overseen the Caldwell Family Trust for over 2 decades. Harrison was a professional who never called my personal encrypted line unless a situation required immediate, highly sensitive authorization. I answered the call, my posture instantly straightening. "Mr. Caldwell," Harrison began, his tone strictly professional, but carrying a subtle undercurrent of urgent concern. "I apologize for interrupting your afternoon, but we have a highly irregular compliance issue regarding Natalie's primary trust account." My heart slowed its rhythm, beating with a cold, heavy certainty. Approximately 20 minutes ago, Harrison explained. Tristan Pierce entered our downtown branch. He presented a fully executed joint asset authorization amendment, legally merging his financial portfolio with Natalie's trust. Accompanying this amendment was an expedited collateral withdrawal request. He is attempting to pull $2 million in liquid cash against the primary trust balance. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his maneuver was staggering. He had bypassed the notary ambush, bypassed the legal waiting period, and marched directly into a federal financial institution to drain my daughter's wealth. Did Natalie accompany him to the branch? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Mr. Pierce stated that she was currently in surgery at the pediatric clinic and could not be disturbed. However, the joint asset amendment he submitted bears her physical signature alongside the stamp of a licensed public notary. The documentation appears entirely legitimate on a surface level, which is why it passed the initial teller review. But given the massive withdrawal amount and the proximity to the wedding, our internal risk management protocols required me to place a temporary hold on the wire transfer until I spoke with you. I sat completely still, staring at the polished wood of my desk. I had personally spoken to Natalie just the day before. She had explicitly promised me that she would not sign any joint asset amendments until my fictional corporate gift was fully finalized after the honeymoon. My daughter never broke a promise to me, Harrison, I said carefully, choosing my words with absolute precision. My daughter is indeed working a grueling shift at the hospital today. She has not signed any legal documents, and she certainly has not authorized a $2 million withdrawal for a venture capital closing. The gravity of my statement settled heavily between us. Mr. Caldwell, if Natalie did not sign this joint asset amendment, then the signature on this federal banking document is a direct forgery. Mr. Pierce has submitted falsified legal documents to a federally insured institution in an attempt to extract $2 million. That is a Class B federal felony. It constitutes severe wire fraud and bank fraud. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound, icy satisfaction wash over my entire body. Tristan had crossed the absolute point of no return. He believed his superficial charm and the fast-approaching wedding date would rush the bank through their standard verification protocols. He had just handed me the final rusted nail for his own coffin. "What are your instructions, sir?" Harrison asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Shall I contact the federal authorities immediately and have him detained in the branch lobby?" "No," I replied instantly. "Do not alert him. If you arrest him now, he will claim it was a desperate misunderstanding. He will hire a defense attorney and tie this up in litigation for years. I want him completely destroyed, on my own terms, in a way that leaves him absolutely no avenue for escape." I stood up and began pacing the length of my study. "I need you to formally reject the withdrawal request, Harrison. Tell Tristan that the capital transfer failed a secondary compliance review due to international tax hold regulations. Tell him the funds cannot possibly be cleared until late next week. Give him a highly technical bureaucratic excuse that he cannot possibly argue against. Let him walk out of the bank believing his transaction was merely delayed, not discovered." "Understood, sir. And the forged documents?" "Secure them in your primary vault," I instructed. "Scan high-resolution copies of every single page, including his physical identification records and the security camera footage of him presenting the forged amendment to the teller. Send all of those encrypted files directly to my personal corporate attorney, Gregory Hughes. We are going to need that irrefutable evidence very soon." "I will handle it immediately, Mr. Caldwell." I terminated the call and placed the phone down on my desk. The silence in my study was absolute. The psychological trap had officially snapped shut. Tristan Pierce had committed a massive federal crime, and I held all the definitive proof. He was now leaving the bank empty-handed, walking back out into the sweltering Dallas heat with the terrifying realization that his violent creditors were going to collect their debt. He had failed to steal my daughter's money. He was completely out of options, but I was not finished. Simply letting the loan sharks break his legs was a temporary, chaotic punishment. I wanted total, structured, permanent ruin. I picked up my phone again and dialed Gregory Hughes. It was time to execute the final invisible maneuver. It was time to quietly purchase his massive debt and become his ultimate master. I dialed Gregory Hughes on my secure line. The connection established with a crisp click, and I did not bother with pleasantries. "Gregory, I need you to initiate a hostile debt acquisition immediately," I instructed, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of my study. "Tristan Pierce owes $4 million. $2 million is held by a private equity firm in New York, and the remaining $2 million is controlled by an unsavory lending syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. I want to buy every single cent of that debt by tomorrow morning." Gregory was a man who had orchestrated billion-dollar mergers, yet I heard a slight pause on his end. "Purchasing distressed debt from a legitimate firm is simple enough, Richard," he replied carefully. "But buying paper from a Las Vegas gambling syndicate is highly irregular. They do not operate through standard corporate channels. They operate for profit," I countered smoothly. "Money is the only language they speak. Use one of our blind shell corporations in Delaware to shield my identity. Offer the New York firm a 10% premium on the principal balance to expedite the transfer. They are preparing to sue him anyway. They will be absolutely thrilled to offload a toxic asset without incurring costly litigation fees. As for the syndicate, wire the funds through our offshore intermediaries. Tell them a silent partner is assuming the risk and paying them in full in cash within 24 hours. They do not care who holds the leash as long as they get their money." "I understand the mechanics," Gregory said, the rhythm of his keyboard already clacking in the background. "But I must ask, why are we doing this? If he just committed a federal forgery, you could simply hand the banking evidence to the authorities right now. He would be arrested before dinner." "Because an arrest is merely a pause in his life," I explained, looking out my window at the sprawling Dallas skyline. "If I simply send him to prison, he will declare bankruptcy. He will wipe his financial slate clean while sitting in a cell. When he eventually gets out, he will have nothing, but he will also owe nothing. I refuse to give him that luxury. I want to own his financial future permanently. When he breached the moral turpitude clause in the investment contract he signed yesterday, he legally triggered a default. By purchasing his massive debt, I become his sole absolute creditor. I am not just going to put him in a cage, Gregory. I am going to build it out of his own greed. And I am going to hold the only key." The line was quiet for a moment before Gregory sighed, a sound of profound professional respect. "I will have the acquisition papers finalized by morning. Consider it done." The next 48 hours were an absolute masterpiece of invisible corporate maneuvering. While Tristan frantically paced the hardwood floors of his rented luxury condominium, desperately trying to figure out how to stall his violent creditors, my legal team moved with ruthless, devastating efficiency. The private equity firm in New York accepted our premium offer within 3 hours. They digitally transferred the original promissory notes, happily washing their hands of Tristan Pierce entirely. The Las Vegas syndicate required slightly more finesse. They were intensely suspicious of the sudden anonymous buyout, but unadulterated greed ultimately conquered their lingering paranoia. When Gregory wired $2 million in clean, untraceable funds through a corporate proxy, they released the debt. They forwarded the illicit lending contracts, effectively transferring the absolute ownership of Tristan's life directly into my waiting hands. By Thursday afternoon, A thick leather binder arrived via private courier to my executive office. I sat alone at my mahogany desk and slowly opened the heavy cover. Inside were the legally binding documents that transferred every single ounce of Tristan's $4 million debt directly to my personal holding company. He was completely, utterly mine. He had absolutely no idea that the terrifying loan sharks he was desperately hiding from no longer cared about him. He had no idea that the corporate lawyers preparing to sue him had already completely dropped their civil case. He believed he was still fighting a desperate war on multiple invisible fronts, completely blind to the crushing reality that I had already quietly conquered the entire battlefield. Later that evening, I received another highly disturbing update from Derek Shaw. The private investigator had continued to monitor Tristan's digital communications. Tristan was rapidly unraveling. The Las Vegas syndicate had completely stopped responding to his frantic text messages. A terrifying, sudden silence he undoubtedly misinterpreted as the quiet before a violent physical storm. In a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, he had contacted his pregnant mistress in Miami. He promised her that a massive influx of capital was imminent and instructed her to start packing for an extended international vacation. He was actively planning to flee the country, the absolute second my fictional $10 million investment cleared his accounts. I stared intensely at the surveillance photos Derek had securely sent, showing Tristan nervously loading expensive luggage into the trunk of his vehicle. He was preparing to completely abandon my beautiful daughter at the altar. He was planning to let her discover his cowardly disappearance on their wedding day, leaving her utterly humiliated in front of our entire social circle, while he escaped to a tropical paradise with her stolen wealth. The sheer calculating cruelty of his backup plan extinguished any lingering trace of mercy I might have still harbored in my soul. I carefully placed the finalized debt acquisition documents into my leather briefcase, alongside the irrefutable evidence of his federal bank forgery. The psychological trap was now perfectly constructed, flawlessly primed and armed with absolutely lethal precision. I had systematically isolated the predator, completely severed his financial lifelines, and quietly bought the very ground he was standing on. Tomorrow was the rehearsal dinner. The lavish event was scheduled to take place at the Ritz-Carlton, an opulent gathering explicitly designed to celebrate the beautiful union of two prominent families. 100 of the most influential, powerful people in Dallas would be sitting inside that grand ballroom, drinking incredibly expensive champagne and happily toasting to a prosperous future. Tristan would be there, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, flashing his bright, charismatic smile, and pretending to be the perfect, adoring groom. He would stand proudly in front of my daughter, my closest friends, and my trusted business associates, entirely convinced that his elaborate web of malicious lies was holding strong. I closed the heavy brass clasps on my leather briefcase. The psychological endurance required to maintain my calm, supportive facade over the past week had been utterly staggering. But tomorrow night, the heavy mask of the generous father-in-law would finally come off. I was going to let him stand up and deliver his deceitful, highly emotional speeches. I was going to let him bask warmly in the polite applause of the unsuspecting crowd. I would let him reach the absolute pinnacle of his arrogant confidence, standing proudly under the very bright glittering lights of the crowded ballroom. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a breathtaking masterpiece of manufactured elegance and staggering wealth. I had spared absolutely no expense for this rehearsal dinner, transforming the massive space into a pristine vision of white orchids, cascading crystal, and soft ambient lighting. 100 of the most influential and powerful people in Dallas occupied the meticulously arranged tables. There were prominent politicians, ruthless hedge fund managers, and titans of commercial real estate, all dressed in their finest evening wear. The soft melodic hum of a live string quartet floated through the air, perfectly masking the heavy, suffocating tension, quietly radiating from my side of the head table. I sat completely still, nursing a glass of sparkling water, observing the elaborate theatrical performance playing out directly in front of me. Tristan Pierce was currently working the room with the practiced, effortless grace of a seasoned politician. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. He moved from table to table, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, and offering bright, charismatic smiles to my closest friends and most trusted business associates. To the untrained eye, he looked exactly like a confident, wildly successful technology executive, deeply humbled to be marrying into the prominent Caldwell family. He projected an aura of absolute invincibility. He firmly believed the $10 million investment contract he signed in my office was currently moving through federal compliance. He believed he had successfully navigated the turbulent waters of his massive financial crisis. He had absolutely no idea the violent loan sharks he was desperately hiding from no longer owned his debt. He was completely oblivious to the crushing reality that the man sitting quietly at the head table was now his sole absolute master. Beside him, my beautiful daughter Natalie was glowing with a profound, radiant happiness that physically ached my heart to witness. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, perfectly accentuating her vibrant, joyful spirit. She laughed at Tristan's rehearsed jokes, looking up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. She had spent her entire day at the pediatric clinic, pouring her boundless compassion into sick children, and now she was celebrating what she believed to be the greatest milestone of her personal life. She firmly believed she was sitting next to her ultimate soulmate. The sheer innocence of her profound trust made my chest tighten with sharp, agonizing sorrow. In order to save her from a lifetime of financial ruin and emotional devastation, I was going to have to publicly execute the man she loved. I was going to shatter her beautiful illusion into a million jagged pieces right here in front of everyone. It was the heaviest, most agonizing burden a father could ever carry. But my resolve remained forged in absolute steel. The dinner service progressed with flawless, orchestrated precision. An army of professional waiters moved silently through the ballroom, delivering courses of butter-poached lobster, perfectly seared Wagyu beef, and delicate truffle risotto. The expensive champagne flowed freely, filling the crystal fluts of my unsuspecting guests. I watched Bradley, the best man, sitting a few seats away. He was sweating profusely in his expensive suit, drinking his wine far too quickly, his eyes darting nervously around the opulent room. He knew exactly what Tristan was planning. He had stood in my private library and laughed about my daughter being a desperate cow. He was a cowardly accomplice to the emotional slaughter of my child, and he would share in the absolute ruin rapidly approaching. As the final dessert plates were gracefully cleared away by the attentive staff, the ambient lighting in the grand ballroom softly dimmed. The low murmur of polite conversation gradually faded into a respectful silence. Tristan stood up from his chair at the center of the long-head table. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and reached for a silver spoon. He tapped the metal gently against the glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound commanding the immediate attention of the entire room. 100 faces turned expectantly toward the handsome, smiling groom. Tristan adjusted his tuxedo jacket and looked out over the sea of wealthy, influential guests. He took a slow, deep breath, perfectly mimicking the slight nervousness of a man overwhelmed by profound emotion. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Tristan began, his voice resonating smoothly through the high-quality surround sound speakers installed around the perimeter of the room. He paused, allowing a soft, affectionate smile to touch his lips. Looking around this magnificent room, seeing so many incredible friends and beloved family members, I am truly humbled. But there is only one person I really want to look at right now. He turned his body slightly, directing his warm, charismatic gaze down to Natalie. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pure happiness. "Natalie, you are the absolute best thing that has ever happened to me," Tristan said, his voice dropping an octave to convey a deeply manufactured intimacy. "Before I met you, my life was consumed by the relentless, chaotic pace of building a technology company. I was moving too fast, always chasing the next big corporate milestone, always looking for the next impossible challenge. But then you walked into my world, bringing your boundless compassion and your beautiful healing spirit. You taught me how to finally slow down. You taught me what it truly means to care for something greater than myself. You saved me, Natalie. You are my anchor, my inspiration, and my greatest achievement. I promise to spend every single day of the rest of my life proving how deeply I love you." A collective audible sigh of deep emotional resonance swept through the crowded ballroom. Several women at the front tables reached into their designer purses for tissues. Natalie reached up and gently wiped a single joyful tear from her cheek. It was a masterful, sickeningly brilliant performance. He was standing there actively plotting to steal her trust fund and abandon her for his pregnant mistress in Miami, while successfully convincing an entire room of intelligent people that he was a devoted, flawless romantic. Tristan then turned his attention away from my daughter and looked directly at me. He raised his crystal flute slightly higher, his confident smile broadening. "And to Richard," Tristan continued, his voice projecting a tone of profound, humble respect. "Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me into your remarkable family with such open arms. Thank you for your incredible generosity, your brilliant mentorship, and your unwavering support. You have built a magnificent empire, sir, and I promise you that I will honor your legacy by taking exceptional care of your most valuable treasure. To Richard and to my beautiful bride." To Richard and Natalie, the grand ballroom echoed loudly, raising all their glasses high. I did not raise my glass. I remained seated at the head of the table, my expression blank. Slowly, I slipped my right hand into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers brushed the cold, hard plastic of the audio-visual remote control. The time for polite illusions was officially over. The storm was here. The applause from this ballroom was deafening as Tristan finished his toast. He stood there soaking in the admiration of Dallas high society, a brilliant actor, taking his final bow before the curtain call. I let the clapping wash over me for a few long seconds, allowing him to experience the absolute peak of his manufactured triumph. Then I stood up. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the polished marble floor. I reached out and took the silver microphone from the center of the table. The sudden movement caught the attention of the room. The applause gradually died down, replaced by a respectful, expectant silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, the patriarch of the Caldwell family, waiting for my blessing. Tristan looked at me with a wide, confident smile, holding his champagne flute perfectly still. Beside him, my beautiful daughter Natalie leaned forward, her eyes shining with pure love and anticipation. She firmly believed I was about to welcome this monster into our family. "Thank you, Tristan," I began. My voice resonated through the high-fidelity surround sound speakers, filling every corner of the massive ballroom. It was deep, measured, and entirely devoid of the warmth I had projected for the past 3 weeks. I looked out at the sea of influential guests. I saw corporate titans, politicians, and medical professionals, who had known my daughter since she was a little girl. I turned my gaze back to the groom. "It is quite funny that you mentioned building an empire tonight," I continued, pacing slowly behind the head table. "Because empires are not built on superficial charm or empty promises. They are built on a foundation of absolute trust. They are built on transparency, loyalty, and the unwavering protection of the people you claim to love. When you invite a man into your empire, you must be entirely certain of his character. You must know exactly who he is when the lights are turned off and the audience is no longer watching." Tristan's smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. A microscopic flicker of confusion crossed his features. He glanced at Bradley, who was currently staring down at his plate, sweating profusely. Natalie tilted her head, sensing the sudden shift in my tone, but still too innocent to understand the impending execution. I stopped walking and stood directly behind Tristan. "Therefore, I decided to verify that character," I said smoothly. I gestured subtly with my left hand toward the production booth at the back of the room. I gave the silent signal to the audiovisual technicians I had personally hired for this exact moment. Suddenly, the elegant ambient lighting in the ballroom went completely dark. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the silent room. Behind the head table, directly behind where Tristan and Natalie were sitting, a massive 30-foot projection screen slowly descended from the ceiling. The heavy canvas unrolled with a heavy, ominous thud. The guests began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Assuming this was part of a surprise wedding video, or a sentimental slideshow to honor the happy couple. Tristan turned around to look at the blank screen, his brow deeply furrowed in genuine confusion. He looked back at me, his mouth opening to ask a question. I did not let him speak. I pressed the small button on the remote control hidden inside my pocket. The high-definition speakers crackled to life. There was no music. There was no video. There was only the crisp, crystal-clear audio recording captured from the shadows of my private library just a few weeks ago. "I would rather chew glass than touch that desperate cow." Tristan's voice boomed through the ballroom. It was loud, distinct, and dripping with absolute, undeniable disgust. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the marble walls. The entire ballroom collectively stopped breathing. 100 of the most powerful people in Dallas froze in sheer, unadulterated shock. The atmosphere instantly shifted from joyous celebration to pure, paralyzing horror. "Come on, man. She is not that bad." Bradley's recorded voice nervously chuckled through the speakers. "Are you kidding me?" Tristan's voice sneered in response, the audio perfectly capturing his cold, calculating arrogance. "She is clingy. She is obsessed. And frankly, she is a desperate cow. But she is the only child of Richard Caldwell. Do you have any idea what that means? Once we sign that registry, I get the keys to the Caldwell Trust Fund. I just have to play the doing husband for 2 years. Then I cash out, file for divorce, and I am back on a yacht in Miami with Lexi." The recording stopped, leaving behind a silence so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The sheer brutality of the revelation paralyzed everyone present. Then, the physical reality of the devastation struck. A sharp, violent, shattering sound pierced the quiet. Natalie had dropped her crystal champagne flute. It hit the marble floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards around her designer heels. I looked down at my daughter. The vibrant, radiant color had completely drained from her face, leaving her as pale as a ghost. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly at the dark screen, her mind desperately trying to reject the horrifying truth that had just violated her ears. She opened her mouth, letting out a small, choked gasp, as if she had just been physically struck in the chest. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fragile, broken agony that physically shattered my heart. I wanted to hold her, to shield her from the pain, but the operation was not yet complete. I had to finish the demolition. Tristan sprang up from his chair, as if he had been burned with a branding iron. The flawless, confident facade he had worn for the past year disintegrated in an instant. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. His chest heaved rapidly as he looked out at the sea of horrified guests. Prominent socialites were covering their mouths in shock. Corporate executives were glaring at him with open, unmasked disgust. The best man, Bradley, had practically slid out of his chair, desperately trying to shrink away from the devastating fallout of his complicity. "Turn that off," Tristan screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he pointed a shaking finger at the projection screen. "That is not real. It is a complete lie. That is artificially generated audio. It is a malicious, deep fake designed to ruin my reputation. Richard, what is the absolute meaning of this?" I did not flinch. I did not yell. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the desperate, cornered predator thrashing in the very trap I had built for him. He was frantically trying to salvage his burning ship, throwing desperate lies into the suffocating atmosphere of the room. He was hoping to cling to any fragment of plausible deniability, completely unaware that I was holding an entire arsenal of heavy artillery, ready to completely obliterate him. I remained standing behind Tristan, holding the silver microphone with a firm, unwavering grip. The sheer panic radiating from him was palpable, a desperate energy crackling through the dark, silent ballroom. He thought he could wave his hands, yell the word deepfake, and magically erase the cold recorded reality that had just boomed from the speakers. He thought he was dealing with an emotional, tech-illiterate old man who could be easily intimidated by modern buzzwords. He was about to learn just how horribly he had miscalculated. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a shouting match. I simply looked at him with an expression of icy, detached amusement, reached into my jacket pocket, and pressed the remote control a second time. The dark projection screen behind the head table flickered to life. A crisp, high-definition image illuminated the massive canvas, casting a stark white glow over the 100 horrified faces in the audience. It was not a sentimental family slideshow. It was a digital dossier of total financial ruin. The first slide displayed high-resolution scans of official bank ledgers certified by forensic accountants. Prominently highlighted at the top in bold red ink were the numbers detailing Tristan's $4 million debt. The breakdown was brutally clear. $2 million owed to a private equity firm in New York, currently pursuing him for corporate fraud, and $2 million owed to an illicit lending syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. A collective audible gasp rippled through the room. Several prominent business associates seated near the front leaned forward, their eyes widening as they recognized the official seals of the institutions involved. "You claimed the audio was a deep fake, Tristan," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "Tell me, is this spreadsheet a deep fake as well? Are these certified records of your $4 million insolvency also generated by artificial intelligence?" Tristan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a corpse under the bright stage lights. He spun around, staring at the screen in utter horror, as if looking into the depths of hell. I clicked the remote again. The slide transitioned instantly. The next image displayed a series of wire transfer receipts from an offshore account in the Bahamas. Over the course of 12 months, $30,000 had been systematically transferred every single month to a private account in Florida. Directly beside the financial receipts was a high-resolution photograph taken on a sun-drenched deck in Miami. It showed Tristan wearing dark sunglasses, laughing carelessly on a luxury yacht, his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a 24-year-old blonde model named Lexi. Her form-fitting dress left no room for doubt. She was visibly, undeniably, 4 months pregnant. The ballroom descended into complete unbridled chaos. Several women gasped aloud, covering their mouths in sheer disbelief. Men whispered furiously to their wives, pointing at the massive screen. The pristine facade of Dallas high society shattered in a matter of seconds. The prestigious guests, who had just been politely sipping champagne, were now witnessing the public, methodical execution of a con artist. I turned my gaze away from the crowd and looked down at my daughter. The sight of Natalie broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. The radiant, joyful bride of 5 minutes ago was completely gone. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands trembling violently in her lap. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the photograph of Tristan and his pregnant mistress on the yacht. She looked at the dates on the wire transfers, realizing that while Tristan was whispering promises of eternal devotion to her in Dallas, he was actively financing a second family in Florida with money he intended to steal from her. The profound, agonizing shock in her eyes slowly morphed into a cold, devastating clarity. The veil of naive, unconditional love that had blinded her for a year was violently ripped away, exposing the ugly, predatory reality underneath. "Tristan," Natalie's voice cracked, breaking through the chaotic murmurs of the room. It was not a cry of anger. It was a sound of profound, soul-crushing betrayal. Is that real? Natalie, please." Tristan turned toward her, his hands outstretched in absolute desperation. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, ruining his tailored tuxedo collar. "She is nobody. I swear to you, it is not what it looks like. I was being set up. I love you." "You love my trust fund," Natalie retorted, her voice suddenly dropping into a register of quiet, lethal fury I had never heard from her before. She stood up slowly from the head table, her emerald gown catching the light. She looked at the man she had planned to spend her life with, her expression transforming from heartbroken bride to an immovable wall of disgust. "You never loved me. You looked at me and saw a payday." I stepped between them, placing myself firmly in front of my daughter, like a protective shield. I looked directly at Tristan, my thumb resting over the remote for the final fatal slide. "We are not quite finished, Tristan," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute authority, because being a bankrupt fraud and a serial liar was apparently not enough for you. You decided to take it a step further 2 days ago. I clicked the remote one last time. The screen displayed a high-resolution scan of a federal banking document. It was the Joint Asset Authorization Form submitted to the Caldwell Wealth Management Branch. At the bottom of the page, directly beside Tristan's signature, was Natalie's name. Except the handwriting was jagged, forced, and completely unnatural. Directly beside the document was a crystal-clear, high-definition security camera frame capturing Tristan standing at the bank teller window, hand-delivering the falsified paper to extract a $2 million advance. "This is your fiancé, Natalie," I announced loudly, ensuring every single guest in the ballroom heard every syllable. "A man so suffocated by his debts to loan sharks that he entered a federal financial institution 48 hours ago and forged your physical signature to steal $2 million directly from your trust." The revelation hit the room like a physical explosion. Bradley, the best man, abruptly pushed his chair back and bolted toward the side exit, completely abandoning his friend to face the carnage alone. The remaining guests stared at Tristan with unmasked hatred. He was no longer just a sleazy gold digger. He was a desperate, dangerous criminal, exposed in front of the most powerful legal and political minds in the state of Texas. Tristan looked around the room, realizing that every exit was blocked, every lie was exhausted, and his brilliant, manipulative scheme had completely collapsed into ashes. The cornered rat was finally out of room to run. For 5 agonizing seconds, Tristan Pierce stood completely frozen under the harsh glare of the massive projection screen. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at the influential Dallas executives, the prominent politicians, and the wealthy socialites who had been admiring him moments ago. He saw nothing but absolute unmasked revulsion staring back at him. He looked at Natalie, who was sitting frozen in her chair, staring at him with a cold, devastating clarity that stripped away every ounce of the power he once held over her. His carefully constructed world had been systematically annihilated. I watched the physical transformation happen in real time. The charming, sophisticated technology executive completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, vicious predator backed into a corner. When a narcissist realizes his elaborate deception has failed, he does not feel remorse. He does not apologize or seek forgiveness. He goes to war. Tristan let out a sound that was half sob and half furious snarl. He lunged forward, his hands slamming down onto the white tablecloth. Silverware clattered loudly against the fine china, breaking the heavy silence of the grand ballroom. He reached across the floral centerpieces, his fingers closing aggressively around a spare silver microphone resting near the podium. He snatched it up, his knuckles turning completely white. The screech of audio feedback pierced the air, causing several guests in the front row to wace and cover their ears. Tristan gripped the microphone tightly, his chest rising and falling as he glared directly at me. His handsome face was now contorted into an ugly mask of pure malice. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Richard?" he spat, his voice echoing violently through the high-definition speakers. "You think you can just stand up here and humiliate me in front of all these people? You think you have won because you put a few bank statements on a projection screen? You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my face an impenetrable fortress of calm. I let him dig his grave deeper. He turned his venomous gaze away from me and looked down at my daughter. Natalie flinched instinctively, pulling her arms around herself as if shielding her body from a physical blow. "You want to talk about transparency?" Tristan shouted, pacing back and forth behind the head table like a caged animal. "You want to talk about exposing the real truth to the good people of Dallas? Let us talk about the flawless Dr. Natalie Caldwell. Let us talk about the perfect pediatrician who spends her days saving children." A wave of fresh, terrifying tension washed over the crowded ballroom. The guests who had been whispering in shocked disbelief just moments ago were now completely silent. They were held hostage by the sudden aggressive escalation of a man pushed to the absolute brink. Tristan pointed a shaking finger directly at my daughter. "I have lived with you for a year, Natalie," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "I have had unlimited access to your personal phone, your private computer, and your secure cloud storage. Do you really think a man like me walks into an empire like this without securing a massive insurance policy?" He turned back to face me, a manic smile stretching across his sweating face. "I have photographs, Richard. I have highly sensitive, deeply compromising digital files, things from her college years, private videos and intimate conversations that she shared with me in absolute confidence, things that would completely destroy her medical career. If I leak those files to the local press, the hospital board will revoke her medical license before sunrise. She will never practice medicine again. She will be a public disgrace, a walking scandal that taints the Caldwell legacy forever." Gasps of genuine horror erupted from the audience. Several prominent doctors seated near the center aisle stood up, their faces flushed with anger, ready to intervene. But I raised my left hand, gesturing for them to remain seated. I could not allow anyone else to step into the line of fire. This was my battle to finish. I looked at Natalie. She was staring at Tristan in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. She knew there were no compromising photographs. She knew she had never sent him anything scandalous. She lived a quiet life, focused entirely on her medical career. But in the age of digital manipulation and relentless media scrutiny, the mere threat of a scandal was often enough to ruin a reputation permanently. Tristan was bluffing, but it was a terrifying bluff from a man who had nothing left to lose. He knew that the mere suggestion of impropriety could cast a long, dark shadow over her professional life. He was banking on my parental instinct to protect her from any potential harm, no matter how fabricated the threat might be. He gripped the microphone with both hands, his chest heaving as he delivered his final ultimatum. "You are going to take your phone out right now, Richard," Tristan demanded, his voice cracking wildly under the immense pressure. "You are going to authorize the immediate transfer of $10 million into the offshore account you just displayed on that screen. You are going to wire that money right now in front of all these people. If that capital does not clear my account in the next 5 minutes, I will hit send on my phone. I have an automated email drafted to every major news outlet and gossip blog in the state of Texas. You wire the money, and I walk out those doors, and you never see me again. You refuse, and I burn your precious daughter to the ground." The room froze. The air was thick with a heavy, suffocating dread. Tristan reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his mobile phone, holding it high in the air for everyone to see. His thumb hovered dramatically over the screen, ready to execute his digital extortion. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between me, my daughter, and the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. He firmly believed he had just regained the upper hand. He believed he had successfully leveraged his way out of complete annihilation. I stood perfectly still, letting the terrifying weight of his threat hang heavily in the quiet atmosphere of the room. I looked at the panicked, desperate man, holding my daughter's reputation hostage. I saw the absolute terror vibrating through his rigid posture. He was a cornered rat, lashing out with the only weapon he had left. The executives in the audience watched me with bated breath, waiting to see if the real estate mogul would finally bend the knee to save his family from disgrace. They expected me to reach for my phone. They expected me to negotiate, to plead, or to surrender to the blackmail. I did none of those things. I simply stared at him, my expression completely devoid of fear, anger, and any willingness to compromise. The psychological war had reached its absolute crescendo, and Tristan had just played his very last card. I stood perfectly still on the elevated platform. Tristan held his phone like a weapon. He expected me to crumble. He fully expected me to beg. I looked at his sweating face and smiled. It was the cold expression of an apex predator watching his prey step into a lethal snare. "You are attempting to extort me for $10 million, I stated calmly. My voice carried effortlessly through the silent ballroom. "You are threatening to destroy the medical career of the woman you claim to love, unless I transfer wealth into your offshore account. You believe you forced my hand, Tristan, but you fundamentally misunderstood the situation. You assumed I intended to invest in your fraudulent technology company." Tristan lowered his phone. The manic confidence in his eyes flickered, replaced by deep confusion. He looked at me, his chest heaving. "What are you saying now?" he stammered. "I signed the investment contract. You told me the money was clearing federal compliance. I never authorized a wire transfer to your business account," I explained. "I used my commercial real estate capital for a completely different purpose. I used my money to purchase your debt. I bought the $2 million obligation from the private equity firm in New York. I used a corporate proxy to buy the remaining $2 million from the lending syndicate in Las Vegas. I paid them in pure liquid cash. They released your promissory notes directly to my holding company. I am not your investor, Tristan. I am your absolute creditor. You owe me $4 million. The color completely vanished from his face. His jaw went slack. The physical phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the polished marble floor. He stared right at me. He realized that the violent loan sharks he desperately hid from were no longer chasing him. They had sold his debts to me. The private equity firm had sold his obligations to me. He was trapped in a prison of his own making. But I signed an agreement, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gasps of the wealthy audience surrounding us. You promised me $10 million. You promised me that money would clear by Wednesday. Yes, I replied smoothly, projecting absolute control over the situation. You signed a 50-page legal document without bothering to read the fine print. You were profoundly blinded by your greed and failed to recognize the blanket lien my attorneys meticulously placed on every asset you possess. You willingly pledged your luxury condominium, your expensive vehicles, your hidden offshore bank accounts, and your fraudulent shell company as direct collateral for a loan you were never going to receive. You formally agreed to a moral turpitude clause. The legal agreement explicitly states that if you commit any act of fraud or extortion, the entire debt becomes payable immediately on demand. You attempted to extort me for $10 million in front of 100 prominent witnesses. You deliberately triggered the default clause yourself. Tristan staggered backward, as if physically struck. His shoulders slumped as the reality of his inescapable situation crushed him. He had no money left to steal. He had no leverage to exploit. He was $4 million in debt to the man whose family he maliciously tried to destroy. I now legally own your luxury condominium, I stated coldly. I completely own your bank accounts. I own every asset you will acquire for the rest of your miserable life. You will spend decades trying to pay me back, and you will never succeed. But financial ruin is only the beginning of your punishment. I turned my gaze away and looked toward the back of the grand ballroom. I gave a subtle nod to the security team. The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding thud. My corporate attorney, Gregory Hughes, walked confidently into the room. He was flanked by 4 federal agents, wearing dark suits and unforgiving expressions. They moved with swift authority down the center aisle, parting the sea of shocked guests. Tristan turned his head and saw the federal agents rapidly approaching the head table. Complete terror consumed his features. He looked around frantically, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. The ballroom was completely sealed. He was surrounded by the people he tried to deceive, and the law enforcement officials he could never manipulate. His breathing became erratic, as his complete failure became a permanent reality. "Richard, please," Tristan begged, his voice cracking wildly as the agent stepped onto the elevated platform. "I was just joking. I was angry. I did not mean any of it. Natalie, tell them I was upset." He reached toward my daughter, pleading for her to save him. Natalie did not move. She stood up perfectly straight, her emerald gown catching the light. She looked directly at the broken man. Her eyes were devoid of affection. The illusion was eradicated. The lead federal agent stepped in front of Tristan. He reached to his belt and pulled out heavy steel handcuffs. "Tristan Pierce," the agent said, his voice echoing clearly, "you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and the forgery of a federal banking document. You are also charged with attempted extortion." The agent grabbed Tristan by his shoulder. and forcefully spun him around, pressing his chest against the white tablecloth. The click of the handcuffs securing his wrists sounded loud. Tristan began to sob openly. It was a pathetic sound. He wept for his lost freedom. "No," he cried out, as the agents pulled him away. "Please do not do this. I am sorry." I watched with satisfaction as they dragged him across the marble floor. He struggled weakly against their grip. The wealthy guests watched him in absolute disgust. He was paraded through the center aisle, stripped of his dignity and freedom. As Tristan was pulled toward the exit, he looked back at Natalie one final time. He opened his mouth to beg, but she cut him off. She pulled the expensive engagement ring off her finger. She held it over his half-empty champagne flute and dropped it. The diamond hit the glass. "You can use that to pay your defense attorney," she said quietly. Her voice was steady and resolved. "Goodbye, Tristan." The agents pulled him through the heavy doors, and the click of the latch echoed with finality. The predator was gone. The grand ballroom remained perfectly silent. I turned to look at my beautiful daughter. The strength she displayed made my chest swell with pride. She faced betrayal and emerged with her dignity intact. I walked over and opened my arms. The strong facade she maintained cracked. She sobbed and stepped into my embrace. She buried her face against my shoulder, crying for the man she had known. I wrapped my arms around her, shielding her from the audience. "I have got you, sweetheart," I whispered softly. "You are safe now. I will always protect you." The psychological war was officially over. The trap had worked flawlessly. I successfully dismantled the man who tried to destroy my family and ensured he would never harm my daughter again. The days following the catastrophic rehearsal dinner moved with a swift and merciless rhythm. Tristan Pierce was immediately remanded into federal custody, denied bail due to his significant flight risk and the sheer weight of the irrefutable evidence we handed directly to the prosecution. His trial was a brief, humiliating affair. Stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated charm, he sat at the defense table looking like the empty, hollow shell he truly was. The federal judge showed absolutely no leniency. Tristan was sentenced to 8 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive bank fraud, identity forgery, and attempted extortion. He was permanently removed from civilized society. But his incarceration was only the first phase of my promise. I had acquired his entire $4 million debt, and I intended to collect every single cent. Through Gregory Hughes, I executed the blanket lien with ruthless surgical precision. I legally seized his luxury condominium in the heart of downtown Dallas. I seized his expensive imported vehicles, his designer watch collection, and his hidden offshore bank accounts. I mercilessly liquidated his entire pathetic existence, selling off the physical manifestations of his superficial greed to the highest bidders. When the final asset was sold and the accounts were completely drained, I took the entirety of the recovered funds and donated them to a prominent domestic abuse shelter in Miami. I made the substantial donation entirely in Natalie's name. It was a fitting poetic conclusion. The money he had stolen and manipulated to fund his secret life was ultimately used to protect and empower vulnerable women. For Natalie, the immediate aftermath of the betrayal was a period of profound, quiet mourning. She did not mourn the man who was sent to federal prison. She mourned the beautiful, innocent illusion she had loved so deeply. She took a month away from her grueling schedule at the hospital, retreating to the safety of our family estate to process the traumatic ordeal. We spent countless hours walking through the sprawling gardens together, talking openly about her late mother, about trusts, and about the harsh realities of the world outside our walls. I watched my beautiful daughter navigate the darkest chapter of her life with a quiet, fierce grace that filled me with overwhelming pride. She realized that she did not need a charismatic, manipulative partner to validate her immense worth. She was already complete. When she finally emerged from that period of healing, she was fundamentally transformed. The gentle, compassionate pediatrician remained, but she was now fortified by a profound, unshakable wisdom. She decided that she no longer wanted to work under the bureaucratic constraints of a massive city hospital. She wanted to build a sanctuary of her own, a place where she could practice medicine strictly on her own terms. 6 months after Tristan was taken away in handcuffs, Natalie officially opened her own independent pediatric clinic. She funded the entire operation herself, using the very trust fund that Tristan had so desperately tried to steal. I attended the grand opening ceremony, standing quietly in the back of the bright, welcoming reception area. I watched as she confidently directed her new medical staff and greeted the families who had followed her to the new practice. Her eyes were vibrant and completely free of the heavy shadows that had haunted her months ago. She was thriving, building her own magnificent legacy from the ground up. Later that evening, after the clinic had closed and the staff had gone home, Natalie and I sat together in her new private office. We drank cheap coffee from paper cups and talked about the future. The bond between us had been tested by fire and forged into something completely unbreakable. She looked at me across her new desk, her expression reflecting an absolute profound trust. She thanked me for protecting her, for seeing the truth when she was blinded by love, and for having the courage to do what was necessary, no matter how difficult it was. I smiled, taking her hand in mine, and told her that protecting her was the greatest privilege of my entire life. I am 70 years old. I have negotiated thousands of highly complex and lucrative deals with ruthless individuals throughout my long and extensive career. I have proudly built a massive commercial real estate empire across the state of Texas that will undoubtedly outlast my lifetime and provide for generations. But standing quietly in that grand ballroom, watching the dangerous, arrogant predator who maliciously called my daughter a desperate cow get dragged away in cold steel handcuffs, I knew I had finally achieved my ultimate victory. It was without a single lingering doubt the absolute greatest and most rewarding return on investment I have ever made in my entire life. True wealth is not measured by the balance in your bank account, but by the lengths you go to protect the people you love. Predators will always exist wearing tailored suits and charming smiles, searching for kindness to exploit. Never let your desire for a peaceful family blind you to the red flags right in front of you. Trust your instincts. When someone shows you their true character in the shadows, believe them immediately. Money can buy houses, companies, and influence, but its greatest power lies in its ability to expose the truth and dismantle those who operate in deceit. If this story of justice and protecting family resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below, telling me where you are watching from and what you would have done in my position. Your support helps me share more incredible life stories with you all.